Hi, and welcome to the Deep Dive, where I, the creator of The Deep End, will go more in depth about each of my shows. This is show number 2. I will go over the processes of making the show, performing the show, and re listening back to it. Then I will give my final thoughts. Alright, to start off is making the show. Now, luckily, I did do this on the right time. However, I turned in, so the professor always asks us to turn in our outlines, which is usually what we type on a like Google Doc or something about what we are going to say or do in our show. So I usually send him like my entire scripts. And normally I am supposed to turn that in like no later than a day before. Well, technically he said that it's supposed to be turned in before the show, and a few hours before technically still counts, but it's the issue of I shouldn't have been working on it on that day. I should have been working on it much sooner, which is kind of a trend with like pretty much all of my shows where I don't give it enough time to be worked on. So it's either I'm showing up an hour before my show, kind of reviewing my script, practicing my voice, stuff like that, or it'll just kind of be like I'll wing it and then I'll mess it up and then I'll cry later. Um, However, I did have really high hopes for this show. I was hoping that this would be much better than the first one, and I mean theoretically it was, but anyway, this one had a much clearer structure. I wanted to do all 3 songs together and typically at the end of the story section. However, when kind of rereading over it, I was extremely confused and realized I kind of rushed a lot of it, which is pretty apparent when you listen to it. I feel like I could have done a much better job, of pacing the story, or at the very least, choosing a different story. Alright, so next is how I felt performing it. And the biggest change was that for this one and for all the others except for the 8th one, I was alone. So I had no active feedback telling me if I'm doing better or worse. I just kind of had to guess. However, I did have a lot higher confidence because of the morale boost when we reviewed each other's shows. Um, but the story, I'm gonna be honest, I didn't like it. I really didn't like it. And doing it it fogged up my brain. It made me extremely nervous, especially like at the beginning. Even though I kind of flowed better into it, I still just wasn't as confident as I could have been. And of course, once again, I keep making mistakes, like when I accidentally play Seven Nation Army when I shouldn't have. And fortunately, I don't know what it is, but I still just don't manage to learn my mistakes in my later shows. Alright, now for when I was listening back to it, kind of as I mentioned earlier, I just didn't really like the story. It felt like I wasn't giving it justice. There was way too much that happened in between, like, Ace finding Betty, but I still was like, no, 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 I could totally put this in an hour-ish radio show. And, well, now the most you know about that story is these characters exist, and you don't even know everything about every character, because especially characters like Gun, you don't get to know their backstory, because obviously, especially if this doesn't go anywhere, you never know who they are, where they actually came from. So, to me, it would have been better as its own either standalone show where it's like an overarching story, or if someone really wanted it, I could just do the entire story of Ace, Quentin, and Betty. But that's most likely not going to happen because without some kind of visual and paycheck, it's hard for me to focus on making something like that, especially when summer comes and I no longer have access to the studio. And then it it just made me feel confused overall. Like I listen to it I'm listening to it usually I'm playing like a game or something, and it's just like my brain feels cluttered because it's like, listening back to your voice with all sorts of extra information as you're trying to focus on something. It makes it kind of unlistenable, if that's a word. Um, but it did kind of teach me a lesson in story writing, or at least story performing, which was don't add one too many characters at the same time. Now, lastly, for my final thoughts, to me, this really did not feel like an improvement, but rather a sidestep. It was still necessary for improving and moving forward with my later shows, but I mean, there was improvement, just a bit though, but it was still like I wanted every show to kind of get slightly better than the last, but this one felt like it set it back a little bit too much. And that is the end of this deep dive. If you had a question that wasn't answered in it, feel free to drop your question in the comments, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. And with that, have yourself a great day.